We are going to turn this discussion over to perhaps the most urgent challenge we have in order to prevent the melting of the Greenland glacier and the Arctic sea ice. Many people don't realize, please come on the stage as well. Many people don't realize that 50% of the energy requirement in the world is for heating and cooling cities. 50%. The entire transport sector, aeroplanes, which we talked about yesterday, cars, ships, 25%. So even if everyone drove a Tesla, yeah, sure, it would matter. But basically it would not prevent the Greenland ice sheet from continuing to melt. In 30 years' time, which is not a long time, in order to hammer that point home, I tell people I was president for 20 years. Quite a number of people in my country thought that was far too long. But for me, it passed very quickly. 30 years, 2050 is only 10 years more than I was president. Then 3/4 of the world will live in Asia and Africa. 2/3 of them will live in mega cities. Mega cities. How these cities, Africa, Asia, of course, in Europe and North America as well, will be heated and cooled. Almost 50% of the energy requirement in Abu Dhabi, where we will hold our next forum, is for the air conditioning. Air conditioning. So whether the Greenland ice sheet continues to melt or not will be determined of how the cities in other parts of the world are heated or cooled, depending on their climate. If we don't succeed in enormous energy transformation in this respect, the game is over. The game is over. It's not about plastic bottles, although plastic bottles, it's important to get away with them. It's not about Tesla cars and electric cars, although that's important. It's basically about the cities. And that's why we have invited these three people here on the stage in this session. The Minister of Climate and Energy in Iceland, one of the leading authorities in the Norwegian energy industry, and the Icelandic entrepreneur and chairman and CEO, who was probably more than anybody else, proved that the Icelandic geothermal model can be a big part of saving the world. So let us start this panel discussion and be ready with your questions by asking the minister, who is responsible for energy and the climate. First time in our history that the same person is responsible for these interlinked sectors. Why has Iceland succeeded in this respect when other countries have this difficulty in getting the importance of the heating and the cooling system? How did it all begin?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is that we had wise leaders, because, and we are should be very grateful, the generations now who have this foundation to be built on. Because when you come here and you see this is so obviously the right thing to do, and the next question, didn't everyone agree? No, it was a political struggle. And it actually was something that I have seen posters which said, vote geothermal, because there was another alternative. And there were hiccups. If you go to Hlemmur Mathöll, then you see a little strange house that said gasstöðin. Nobody knows why it's called gasstöðin, but it actually was utilization for using gas for heating up houses and making electricity until 1956. Because when people were starting taking this debate, then of course was said, what are you saying? Are you going to use something, geothermal, which is unproven? We do have gas, which everyone knows, and is something here for taking. So, and the reason I say this story, and I do it a lot, and of course the Icelanders are always telling stories, I've done it since the settlers' time, is that there's something to learn from today. Because we are taking this same debate everywhere. It's much easier to stick with fossil fuels. We know what we got. But Iceland has shown, and that this can be done in a greener way and cheaper way and a better way. And it's of course a model which has been exported, and we have a Longus entrepreneur which is responsible for that we do not have the largest geothermal heating system longer in Reykjavik. It's in China, and if I am not wrong, then it saves more or similar as the CO2 as the whole emission of Iceland.
Yes, a little bit more.
Yeah. So if that answers your question, then I think that we took the right decision, but then again, it was not easy. It was not without a political debate. It was not without political courage, and we should remember that when we are facing with our big challenge now.
Before we come to the contribution of Norway, you have, Haukur, now for over a decade, in cooperation with one of the largest energy companies in the world, Sinopec in China, contributed to closing down the coal power-driven heating system and replacing it with a localized geothermal. In the light of that experience, you think it's doable to transform the heating and the cooling system in cities in a way that will not threaten the melting of the glaciers in the second half of this century?
Absolutely. I think we have a very massive proof that can be done. When we started in China, was it 15 years ago, everybody told us this is impossible. China is not a geothermal country. It's a coal-driven country, and you can do this stuff in Iceland, which is pretty much a volcano. So if you distill our sort of single contribution to our sort of most important contribution to this industry is we have absolutely proven on a massive scale that geothermal is the most environmentally friendly and also profitable way of providing heating and cooling to cities. And people ask me quite often, is there enough geothermal? Because in the minds of most people, geothermal is the high temperature geothermal that generates electricity, which is important. But they forget that the most important aspect of geothermal is a low to medium temperature, which is ideal for heating and cooling. And that is pretty much in every country. And what about, is there enough geothermal? Absolutely. I want you to think about not one sun, but two suns. The one you see in the skies above us is 150 million kilometers away, and the surface temperature of 5,000 centigrade. The core of the Earth, which is of course the origin of geothermal energy, is 3,500 kilometers under our feet, and the same temperature as the surface of the sun. And it's only 0.0000024% of the distance. So while the core of the Earth is hot, we will have enough geothermal. The challenge is simply how do we capture it and harness it, and we are always learning better and better of how to do that. And so what was started in Iceland can revolutionize the energy industry around the world. Mark my words, the next energy revolution is space heating and cooling, and how that should be done is with geothermal.
Okay, it's an optimistic story, actually a very inspiring story. I often tell people in other countries, for the first decades of my life, over 80% of Iceland's energy was imported oil and coal. Norway is another country which, in addition to the oil and everything else, is a beacon of clean energy utilization. Some people say Norway is now the battery of Europe through the ocean cables. How do you see Norway coming into this global problem of heating and cooling cities?
I come from a company called Aker, and we have a green arm called Aker Horizons. Aker is the biggest, or the second biggest, or the biggest private company in Norway. And one of our companies is Aker BP, which is a large oil company. As a consequence of the energy transition, we have established this platform that's going to focuses on green energy and green energy processes, including hydrogen and other things. We have a large program to build out renewable energy across the world, including in Europe. And we are looking at the opportunity to combine renewable energy with geothermal heating and geothermal electricity for the transition in cities. We see that there's a bigger and bigger need to look at energy systems, and it's the opportunity to look at the combination of geothermal energy together, or geothermal heating together with solar and wind, that are going to kind of lead, or that are going to lead the transition in the European cities. I think it's also important to note, we can think about building as much renewable as we want, but in an energy system, typically you need baseload power. Now in Norway and in Iceland, we're very lucky. We have renewable energy as baseload power. In Norway we have hydropower, here you have geothermal and hydro. In most systems, you need at least you can only do about 30 to 40% renewables outside of geothermal and hydro. That means that you need some stable system or some stable energy to be able to make the transition. And this is what Germany, for example, is struggling with, and what a lot of other countries are going to be struggling with as they try to find out what are going to be the systems that are going to provide the baseload capacity in most countries. So I think geothermal is one of the answers to that problem as the cities try to transition. And I just want to point to a point you made initially here. Heating is 50% of the problem. We work on hard to abate sectors. So for example, we focus on green steel and green fuels and other things like this across the world, where we build facilities with hydrogen and other things. But that only addresses 8% of the problem. The biggest problem we have to address is the issue of heating cities, and find ways to do that. Today that's being done with garbage, coal, gas, and other non-sustainable and non-sustainable sources of energy. And that is one of the things that Europe really, really has to start addressing in the near term.
You want to add something, Minister, to this?
No, just that I think there is no silver bullet when it comes to green energy transition or fighting climate change. But if we do not include geothermal, then that would be, diplomatically said, very unwise. But I think it's impossible to get the results you want to see without using geothermal. And as we all know, you don't need to be living in the most active volcanic island in the world to use geothermal. So the opportunities are there.
Well, if we take the combined emission of China and India as they become economic superpowers in the 21st century, and if they don't transform themselves in terms of heating and cooling in Chinese and Indian cities, as I said in the opening, the game is almost over. So let me ask you, Haukur, what are the most important lessons you have learned in working with the Chinese now for over a decade in this sensitive area?
Yeah, well, maybe the most important lessons we have can maybe learn from the Chinese is the long-term vision. When we started in China, was it 15 years ago, there was not much in terms of a geothermal industry there. Today, we are the world's largest geothermal district heating company, and we have about 35% market share in China, etc., etc. But this is all based, I think, on the Chinese leadership is very, very determined to decarbonize. It would have been so easy for the coal industry, I think, to push us out earlier. But the drive for decarbonization is very important. This is one thing. And another thing is, like I mentioned before, this can be done in countries that people do not perceive as volcanic countries. And as a matter of fact, very, very interestingly, the Chinese economy is still driven on coal. And we managed to take them head on. We have no subsidies. And we are still winning the game.
Now, I often say that as well. The reason why Iceland became a clean energy economy was not because we were climate visionaries. That debate didn't really exist when we started this. It was simply because it was good business. It made a lot of economic sense. And now I think Iceland is the only country in Europe where the energy prices have not increased at all. At all. And there's no debate in Iceland about increasing energy prices, but most European countries are politically shaken up and down because of debate and struggle over energy prices. So I come back to Norway again. The European continent has to go geothermal big time if they're going to stop relying on Russian gas and meet the climate target. These two different conditions that they face. How do you see the potential for cooperation between Norway, Iceland, and other international partners in this area?
I mean, we are in comprehensive discussions with Haukur and his team on how to integrate this into a larger system and to export this knowledge into the European space. We see that Iceland has unique competence and know-how on this, and combining that with the know-how that we have on large-scale oil and gas and on kind of industrial deployment of those type of systems, I think can be a good combination for exporting that know-how into Germany, Eastern Europe, and other places in Europe. This is still a relatively nascent industry. It hasn't gotten the full benefits of scale yet, although it's coming very quickly. But I certainly think that the geothermal heating industry in particular is going to be one of the major sources of energy transition, in addition to the other technologies that we've talked about during the day.
Great. So let me open up for questions from the floor, if there are any. Please put your hands up. Yes, there's one here. Maybe you introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
I can do. My name is Leif Lundsmann. I'm a journalist from Denmark. I noticed you mentioned that heating and cooling, but heating is part of the major consumption of energy. In a warmer world, we will need less heating. Will we need more cooling than the amount we may reduce heating? Because if not, it's part of the solution too, isn't it?
Oh yes. If I may take this question. Cooling is a part of heating. When we talk about heating, we actually are thinking about heating and cooling as well. And as you rightly point out, 70% of humanity lives in areas that need cooling and 30% in areas that need heating. And we are absolutely going full force into geothermal cooling as well. But it's just maybe an industry jargon. When we talk about heating, that includes heating and cooling via geothermal. And geothermal heating is a large business, but we are working on some of the first maybe breakthrough projects in geothermal cooling. You need slightly higher temperature for it, but that's it.
It's a kind of contradiction that you can use the heat under the ground to cool buildings, but I think we are getting there. Okay, so yes, they're here and then in the back. Maybe we take both questions and then the answers, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Gustav Sigman and I come from Nord University in Norway. And I'm definitely not an expert on geothermal investments, but I'm thinking if countries are expected to make this transition, they might be interested in how many jobs can be created during the lifetime of one of these investments. So I can imagine that there would be quite a lot of jobs created when the actual construction is being made, but then I'm a bit unsure how many jobs that will continue during the lifetime of an investment. Thank you.
Okay, and then the woman over there on the sideline, yes. Yes, just behind you. Yeah.
I think just to address your
Let's
question.
take the other question first. Yeah, as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, this is Fan from Center for Handels Logistics from Norway. My question to the panel is that what do you say are the main challenges to scale up the geothermal energy to heat more cities in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, you were starting to...
Yeah, I can at least address the first question. So I think there are two sides to this. In a lot of cities, there is central distribution of heat today. The sources that you use for that are often coal or other thermal types of energy. So kind of the first step is to replace the existing systems with geothermal systems or geothermal heat as the source of energy. So in that regard, there's work when you drill the holes and find and explore and do the regulatory things. But other than that, it's kind of a continuation of maintenance of the systems that are there today. So there's not obviously there's jobs and there's good paying jobs that are needed as you explore geothermal wells, and there's as you have geologists and other oil and gas experts that can be used for these type of fields. It's also a way to transition some of the jobs that are in the oil and gas sector today.
And if I may add to this, if you think about the sheer volume of this project of transitioning, let's say, cities from Lisbon to Vladivostok on the Eurasian continent, it'll take decades to transform the cities. It takes 10 years maybe to transform one city. So we are looking at decades of work. So it's not something that goes over in a flash and then there is just operations and maintenance. So there is a massive amount of jobs there for decades. But as for the geothermal potential in Europe, the European European Council has issued a well-known study that states that known geothermal reservoirs in Europe today hold enough heat to sustainably provide heat to at least a third of the population. And this is just the reservoirs that are known today, applying today's technology. And the same report suggests or assumes that this number is up to 50% by 2050. But keep in mind, at the same time as we are developing, our technology is improving, our subsurface knowledge is improving. We are constantly able to work with lower temperature, which means utilizing more of the resources, and we are constantly drilling deeper. So I think the bottom part of the answer of how much is a third and upwards. And that actually is similar to all the continents.
Yeah. Well,
I would like to add, because when we're talking about the jobs, which comes with the geothermal, I think we are forgetting something really important. And I hope that your foreign guests to come get a little opportunity to enjoy Iceland. And if you do, then I encourage you to go to the swimming pools, the spas and the lagoons, which is, of course, we like it here, and actually we love it, but it can be done in many other parts of the world. And that is, and then also comes when you have hot geothermal water and hot water, you can use it in all kinds of industry. And we are seeing really interesting things now flourish in Iceland because we do have geothermal. And even though it's quite right that when we started this in 1930s, then the main thing was the economical side, but it was interesting to see the posters because they used environmental messages, said that if you vote geothermal, then you will see the sun always, not always the coal, and the dirt or the coals in the house will go, and so forth. But also they promised that you can have greenhouses at every home. That didn't happen, but what happened is that you have hot tubs in many places in Iceland. So I think the opportunities when you are harvesting geothermal and hot water is much more than only when it comes to heating up houses. And one thing is sure, we are not the only ones who can use this.
But don't forget the greenhouses and the tomatoes and the cucumbers
exactly.
and everything else. I don't know how many of you have been to the Blue Lagoon or intend to go to the Blue Lagoon. But you should remember it's basically a spill of water from a geothermal power plant.
What's the problem?
And we charge people 50 euros to bath themselves in a spill of water from a geothermal power plant. Yes.
Just to address your question, kind of what the barriers to the absorption of this technology. And it's basically regulatory. This is relatively unfamiliar technology in a lot of Europe. And as a consequence, there's a lack of regulatory regime. And we're talking about not very complex drilling. We're not drilling very deep at very, very high temperatures. So the risk is relatively small. It should be possible to have a regulatory regime in most countries to address this. But we're seeing that, for example, in one of the countries in Europe which could really benefit from this and where there is a big push, for example, Germany, is lagging significantly in this regard and is struggling with how to find the regulatory regime. So this is a encouragement to the politicians that they need to address this technology relatively rapidly because it's a low-hanging fruit.
Great. We will have a question here from the center and then here. And then also here. Bring the microphone there. Yes, start, please.
Hi. Hello. Hi, I'm Christine Lehexdotter, and I am a former student of Monash University. I have a question in regards to affordability. You say that in Iceland that the prices have very much remained the same by using geothermal energy, whereas prices are going up and down in other countries because they use a different electrical energy system. So hypothetically speaking, if countries were to succeed in implementing geothermal energy into their cities, will the energy prices be more affordable for consumers since electricity and all kinds of energy are getting quite expensive?
Okay, so we take this question as well, and then we take answer to both of them.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Sophia. I'm a master's student at the Iceland School of Energy. Iceland is a beautiful case study, an idea you've made a financial decision to invest in geothermal rather than continuing on your path. Many countries at this moment aren't able to make that financial decision. For example, Germany. At this moment, it may be more economically feasible for them, as well as France, to reopen up their nuclear facilities rather than invest in geothermal. Do you see this having an extreme delay on the prospects of opening up geothermal across Europe? As your data said 2050, but I can see that being pushed much further as people are terrified for this upcoming winter.
Okay, so let's take the final answers to these questions.
Well, I can start with the prices. So geothermal, it is true that the prices are stable, and while Europe is facing a catastrophe today, there is absolutely nothing going on here, as mentioned earlier, nor in the cities in China where we have provided geothermal. But it's not only about price stability, it is also about geothermal will bring people the lowest heating bill, and it's still profitable. It's still great business. So the higher quality of life that Guðlaugur was mentioning, it actually comes as a free bonus.
I can maybe address a couple of these issues from my perspective. The reason that you have a stable, Iceland has an independent system. Europe has an integrated system, and because of the very low reservoir levels in Europe this year, in particular because of the reservoir levels, gas is on the margin and setting the prices, and because of the problems in the Ukraine and the Russian gas prices have gone up, and that's the biggest problem for gas or for the energy prices in Europe right now. I think it's highly likely that you will extend the life of the nuclear plants, and given that Europe is now deploying a lot of offshore wind and a lot of wind resources, as I mentioned initially, you can probably have 40% maximum, at least with today's technology, of renewable energy in the grid. So you need baseload power. And unless we want to run gas and coal plants, the best alternative we have for that is actually nuclear plants. So I think nuclear is going to be a part of the solution over the long term, but it's going to be a transitionary technology. Geothermal is going to play a big part of this energy transition, but it is a long-term play as well, and it's going to take us at least 10, 15 years to deploy it at scale where it has an impact. As we deploy it, it's going to have a relatively significant impact on variable prices, because prices in Europe are variable, and as we implement longer-term geothermal prices, they're going to be stable because they're basically on contract of 20 or 30-year contracts. So what you'll have is you'll have less or lower variable prices as a consequence of a transition from electricity to geothermal heating.
I will give the Minister the final word, so time is already over. Yes.
Well, yes, thank you. And it's been really interesting discussion. I just wanted to add one thing, is that because you mentioned Germany and France, of course, one thing doesn't exclude the other, and we need a lot of solutions, obviously. But I can promise you that Germany and France today are much richer than Iceland was, even per capita, in the 1930s and 1970s. And the reason we are economically in a good place when it comes to life standards and other things is that we do have energy independence, and we are run more or less on green renewable energy, and it's a good business, both short-term but especially long-term.
Thank you very much. We will continue this discussion as we move forward in the coming months and years on the interlinkage between the energy system in cities all over the world and the future of the ice in the Arctic. This is a connection we want to establish very strongly. While I thank you, I also want to say to the audience, we have ahead of us fascinating combination of sessions. Some of them are topics that we have not covered before and considered to be highly vibrant and sensitive in the context of the present global situation. So I encourage all of you to continue in this hall. We will then end with the award of the Arctic Circle Prize for the third time. The first one was given to Ban Ki-moon, the second to John Kerry, and we don't reveal until in the ceremony who will receive it this time. And then it will end with a grand party, the Faroe East Night, hosted by our friends in our neighboring island country. So please continue enjoying these challenging, fascinating sessions that will be on the stage in the next few hours. Thank you very much.